not to look back to FDR and his famous 100 days, and there certainly are similarities. Crisis in finance, rising unemployment, falling GDP, and a financial crisis that really has spread around the world. But there are also lots of differences. We're not as badly off. There isn't a safety net in most industrial countries. There are new institutions. There are supports for the banking system. And one of the contrasts, really, is that there was also a London conference scheduled in 1933. And Franklin Roosevelt chose not to go. But in this case, when the G-20 gathered, the G-20 being 20 major economies from around the world, gathered in London, President Obama was very much there. And at this conference, the G-20 collectively promised significant new resources for the International Monetary Fund and some additional resources for the World Bank. And they also gave the IMF a whole new set of responsibilities and arguably a new set of powers. And I'm going to pose a few questions for our distinguished panel as soon as I introduce them. To my right, an old friend, Clyde Prestowitz, very well known in Washington. Clyde, before founding the Economic Strategy Institute, served in the Reagan administration as a senior advisor on trade and in particular U.S.-Japan relations to Secretary of Commerce Malcolm Baldrige. He is on a number of senior advisory boards and has a number of books to his credit. You may have all read his most recent book, 3 Billion New Capitalists, The Great Shift of Wealth and Power to the East, a subject that seems even more prominent today, perhaps, than when Clyde published his book. And he has another one in mind, and I'm urging, of course, you all to wait excitedly for this new book called The Great Betrayal. And I think it's going to take a look at the decisions that were made, or in many cases, the decisions that were not made that contributed to this crisis. To my left and your right is Adam Posen, another old friend. Adam's a very distinguished economic presence in Washington. He is currently the deputy director of the Peterson Institute on International Economics. He has 5 books to his credit. I'm very intimidated sitting between these two erudite gentlemen. And his latest book, which will be out shortly, soon, Why Reform a Rich Country? Germany and the Future of Capitalism. Another question that's very much on the table as people say, well, is the Anglo-American model really the way we want to go anymore? Well, let me just ask these gentlemen, starting with what happened at the G20 and the new financial resources that have been promised. We start with Clyde. Clyde, is that going to do it? Are we going to find ourselves moving in the right direction?
Let me begin first by noting that Kent also has a book to his credit. And actually, I'm, as he said, in the course of writing a book right now. And I'm finding that that I can't write my book without Kent's book. It's really a very valuable resource. So thank you, Kent.
That's building the next American economy. It is a gift-giving season. I urge you all to Amazon.com.
Really? It's worth it.
It's the perfect Mother's Day.
It's worth it. Anyhow, G20. One, I myself am very encouraged by the advent of the G20. I think it begins to break the logjam of the fact that for a long time the major developing countries, India, China, and others, have not been adequately represented at the table, and I think G20 is beginning to fill that role. I think that the London conference was on balance very encouraging. No, I don't think that the resources that are the new resources for the IMF are not sufficient, but they're a step in the right direction. And I think that the beginning of discussion about reform of the IMF and some shift in the balance of power in the IMF, this is all, I think, very positive. It needs to keep on going. I have been very encouraged, frankly, by the Chinese proposals for reviewing the role of the dollar and increasing the use of SDRs. I personally think the role of the dollar is a major negative factor in the global economy, both for us and for the rest of the world. The dollar allows us, because we print the dollar, it allows us to be irresponsible. We don't have to worry about deficits. We don't have to worry about savings. All we have to do is print dollars so we can be irresponsible. We can overconsume. But it also allows other countries to be irresponsible because they can manage the value of the dollar to promote trade surpluses and current account surpluses, which eventually become destabilizing. So I'm very interested in what the Chinese are talking about, and I think that is a good outcome of the G20.
Well, Adam, what do you think? Is this a sign of the times that it's the G20, not the G7?
Well, first, let me make the obligatory thank you to Kent and to David for inviting me, all of you for coming out for the free lunch. It's also a big honor for me to be on the same panel with Clyde. Clyde's very gracious, but any one of his books has sold more than my entire output in my career, and is likely to remain so. And of all Clyde's books, the one I admired most was a very brave book he did a few years ago called Rogue Nation. And the reason I bring that up is the attempt to create the G20 and to provide new resources and perhaps powers, I think Kent's right to phrase it that way, to the IMF, I think is an important step forward from the United States from the perspective of changing the world we were in when Clyde was writing Rogue Nation. The idea that it is in the enlightened self-interest of the U.S., and I mean that not as a catchphrase, but truly, to recognize the reality that it cannot make all decisions on its own, to recognize the reality that the world has changed and we are still the largest and strongest and bestest, but not by as large a margin as we once were, and to recognize the reality that being unjust in not letting billions of the world's people have a direct say in economic decisions is a bad idea. And so I think in that fundamental sense, reflecting broad foreign policy trends that many of you are aware of, the G20 process, which means bringing the major emerging markets to the table for discussions in a formal way along with the old rich countries, and providing more resources to the IMF and to the World Bank, I think is the right general way to go. As with all these things, though, there's a difference between motivations and specifics. I should disclose I did some advising to Gordon Brown. The UK was host of the summit, and I tried to work with them and help them a bit on that. And so obviously I'm pretty happy in some ways with how the summit turned out. But picking up on what Clyde was saying, there's sort of two tracks. Let me say there's three tracks to this. There's one, which is the one I've already emphasized, which is governance. And in a sense, we're part of the way there, but in a sense, we've made very little difference. The U.S. and Western Europe still have a disproportionately large share in the say at the International Monetary Fund, at the World Bank, and de facto in other forums that deal with global economic issues. And it is zero-sum in the sense that if you have 100% voting shares total, and the U.S. has too much, and Europe has too much, and China has too little, and India has too little, somebody has to redistribute. And for all the talk, the U.S. has not been in any way, shape, or form willing to do anything on that front, nor is Western Europe. And so in that sense, I'm a little surprised at the fact that the Chinese and the Brazilians and the Indians and the Saudis actually played as nice as they did at the G20, because they got very little on that front. The second front, I'm sorry to go on so long, I'll wrap this up quickly. The second front is the immediate crisis relief, and here I agree with Kent and with Clyde. Oh, maybe Kent didn't say this, but I think he would agree. It's good for the IMF to have enough resources on hand that when you get countries that get into major trouble, like Hungary, like Latvia, like Mexico right now, through not necessarily any fault of their own or get into trouble way out of proportion to what their fault was, you want a system that allows them to work it out, and that's what the IMF is for. And that's the traditional IMF mission, what used to be called dealing with balance of payments crises. And the fact that we are funding the IMF to do that, and lots of countries are making use of that, is a good thing. Not good that they're in that problem, but it's good that they're able to make use of that. And many of you may have seen the story in today's Washington Post about how some Latin American countries that never wanted to go to the fund are now going back to the fund. The final point, which is much more complicated, is the one where Clyde raises about currencies. And I guess I should stop there, but just to say, nothing was really done about that at the G20. Nothing is being done at the IMF level to really address that. And it's not entirely clear there is anything that can be done to address that. So,
well, what about the new powers from your point of view? You read in the paper that Secretary Geithner has welcomed or acquiesced in an IMF review of the U.S. financial system, which really would be a departure. Is this, how much of a departure is this?
I welcome Secretary Geithner's welcoming statement. I mean, it's the IMF has never reviewed the U.S. economy, and so it's a bit of a step away from the standard ignoring of the subject. But it's hard to imagine that Geithner is really just sitting over on the edge of his chair waiting for the IMF to review the U.S. economy. I hope it does. I think it would be a salutary exercise. I think that we in the U.S. live in a kind of a make-believe world in which we assume, I mean, the air we breathe is such that there's never any question that we proceed from the premise we're the most advanced economy, we're the strongest economy, we're at the cutting edge of economic growth, etc. And I think actually many in the IMF look at the U.S. and but for the fact that the dollar is the world's reserve currency, the U.S. looks kind of like Indonesia or maybe Argentina is too strong a word, but it doesn't look nearly as great as we think. So I would like to have I'd like to see an IMF review that kind of really presented a picture of the U.S. to the U.S. public that is less rosy than the one that we kind of give ourselves.
I have to make a factual correction here. The IMF has actually reviewed the U.S. economy on a regular basis. Like all member states of the IMF, they're subject to what's called Article 4 consultations, which means that I can't remember if it's every year or every other year. Basically, somebody who's the country officer for that country and a whole passel of experts from various departments of the IMF meets with all the officials, goes through the data, writes a report. Now, this sort of gets at the core of the issue. What Secretary Geithner welcomed was something called an FSAP, a Financial Stability Assessment Program, which was something that in the late Clinton years was advocated to be done for other countries, and then in the early Bush years, again in line with the rogue nation, or say the U.S. on International Criminal Court, the U.S. said, well, no FSAP for us, that's for other people. And so what Geithner was doing was simply removing the exceptionalism of the U.S. on that specific program. But I think this does, and for people like me who are in the weeds in this stuff, the Article 4s on various countries from the IMF, which are published on their website and are totally open and have lots of documentation, are very useful. But in the end, going back to what they're saying about sitting on the edge of your seat, they don't have very much teeth or power. And this is for two reasons. First is, if you are a major country and you are a major shareholder in the IMF, and your representative on the board of directors, your ED, your executive director, gets to review the Article 4 and can block might be a little strong, but can work very hard to limit the amount of things said about your country. And this extends not just for the U.S. or China. It goes all the way down to some very medium-sized countries. It's only the countries in deep trouble, the Thailand in 97, Mexico in 94, Hungary today, that really have to fear getting the report. But even then, sometimes the IMF feels caught because there's this feeling that if they really say what's going on, they may cause a crisis rather than preempting it. So the reports are useful, they're interesting, they're part of a good exercise, but it sort of underlines there's real reasons why IMF surveillance hasn't been that potent in the past. And it's not an institutional failure, it's just fundamentally this kind of reporting doesn't really do anything.
And I'm going into the G20 discussions, and I think Gordon Brown was part of this. There was really a call for some international standards and an international regulator. Did they take a step in that direction? Is this something that's on the near horizon?
Standards, yes. Regulator, no. It's a simple answer. The U.S., but surprisingly, even some of the countries that were advocating very strongly for increased financial regulation, like Germany, do not want regulation coming from outside their borders on these issues. And it's partly political pandering and nationalism, but partly it's a very fundamental reality that if a bank gets into trouble, it's your nation, your budget that has to bail them out, as the people on Capitol Hill have now discovered. And so that's why even within Europe, where there's a lot more intellectual consensus on banking, they haven't managed to get coordinated pan-European regulation even there, because the Germans don't want to be liable for the Hungarian banks or the Austrian banks and vice versa.
Go back to that question of current accounts and currencies. It wasn't really dealt with. That there are, perhaps not a consensus, but there's a growing opinion that in fact these enormous imbalances contributed, either contributed directly or certainly created an environment which encouraged the lending practices that created this financial crisis. Clyde, what do we do about these current account imbalances?
Well, Kent, that's a question that I asked you about 25 years ago.
What did I say?
Whatever it was the wrong answer. Oh, this is, I think, really kind of the core of the problem. I mean, in fact, the current account imbalances are being corrected as we speak, because the American consumer has stopped buying. I was at a meeting of the International Chamber of Commerce in Hong Kong just recently, and it was largely attended by CEOs of Asian countries. And of course they were very concerned about what was happening in the U.S. or what wasn't happening in the U.S., but particularly they were worried about protectionism in the U.S. And I tried to explain to them that, of course, there has been a bit of protectionism, but no more than in many other places. But I said, the protectionism is not your real problem. The real problem is that the American consumer is tapped out, cannot continue to consume more or spend more than they earn. And we've seen the savings rate jump dramatically just in the last several months. So, I mean, in a way, the market is attacking and bringing about some balance, but of course it's doing it by way of global recession, if not depression. So the real trick is how do we reestablish growth, but without the imbalances. And I mean, I think that it's one of those things that's kind of, I think it's pretty easy to say. There are the EU, I guess right now, depends on where the exchange rate is, but the size of the EU economy and the U.S. economy are about the same. and then you have Japan and then China. And so if you're going to, the U.S. has been the main driver of the U.S. the buyer of last resort, main center of global demand. And if we're not going to have imbalances in the future, and I think that we can't, then it means that actually Americans are going to consume relatively less, and they're going to produce more of what they consume. And then there's a demand gap, and so how does that demand gap get filled? And one candidate is the EU, just because it's so big. But the EU is already a fairly high consuming economic entity, and given its demographics and given its current politics, it's hard to see the EU replacing the United States in terms of new demand. Japan is a good candidate, but I was present in the room in 1984 when then Prime Minister Nakasone committed that Japan would become an importing superpower. And actually Japan did run a trade deficit last month for the first time in many, many years, but it was largely because they didn't export very much. It wasn't on the import side. Very hard to imagine Japan replacing U.S. demand, and so then you get to China and the rest of the developing world. And I think that a huge adjustment will have to be made in the developing world. And that adjustment is toward more domestic growth and less dependence on exports. That sounds easy, but I was on a panel recently, and one of the panel members was a guy who builds shopping malls in China. And he made a very interesting statement. He said China does not have the infrastructure for consumption. He said, all of the railroads go to the ports. All of the orientation of production is to get goods to the ports, to go out. And there's not the credit infrastructure, not the financial infrastructure, not the physical infrastructure for actually producing goods and having regular consumers consume them in China. And I think that's not just true of China. I think it's true of many other countries in the developing world. And so I think that's a big adjustment that will have to be made, but it's not clear how it's going to be made. And it's just as politically difficult for countries that are focused on production and export to adjust as it is for countries like the U.S. that are focused on consumption to adjust.
Adam, what do you think? Is it time for a Plaza II Accord?
God forbid. Look, Kent designed the panel well, not so much because Clyde and I disagree on values, but we have very different perspectives. Clyde is a person who advises businesses and thinks about things from the trade perspective. I'm a macro finance guy, so I think about things from a different perspective. So let me give you a different perspective than the way Clyde put it. What he's talking about happening is both easy and already going to happen. If you look at the long span of history, when we talk about global imbalances, what you're essentially saying is, as Clyde correctly puts it, you're consuming more than you're saving. Actually, what you're doing is you're consuming and investing more than you're saving, which is an important point. And you look at U.S. savings rate through the years. The last several years, obviously, the savings rate has been paltry. But you go back more than 10 or 15 years, the U.S. household savings rate actually was up around 8% of GDP. And on the numbers of it, the fact that it's jumped up over the last several months to from 0 to roughly 5% of GDP gets us most of the way back to our long-term average. And economists aren't great at predicting moves in savings behavior, but roughly speaking, as long as it stays somewhere between 5 and 7% for the next few years, the global imbalance will be heavily reduced, and reduced to a level we can probably handle without too much trouble. The issue is twofold. I mean, first, why am I making this seem so easy? Well, the thing is, we are indeed having a recession now, in part because everyone's rebuilding their savings, right? So we are shifting demand. But once we've made that shift in demand, as the economy goes forward, you're just spending less out of every incremental dollar. It's not a cutback in growth. You're just reallocating. And part of the issue is that we wasted so much money in the last few years for reasons that had nothing to do with China and nothing to do with our global imbalances of the currency. It had to do with the fact that we wasted a lot of money, whether it was people being sold on the idea that you had to own a house, or you had to do plastic surgery on credit, or you had to have the derivative that insured your company against the paint peeling on your cars sold through Bear Stearns at some incredible complicated contract. Whatever it was, we spent a lot of money on things that were not productive. And if you go back to the late 90s and the start of this decade, we were spending a lot of money, more than we were producing, more than we were saving, but we were spending a lot of it on investment. And during that period, we had productivity growth, and we had large but relatively stable current account balances, and there wasn't really a problem. It was only in the last 4 years when we were spending on things that were not very useful, and we were spending an excessively large amount on consumption, and that happens to be the same time from basically 2004 forward that China's bilateral trade surplus with the U.S. swells enormously. So then the other piece of it is, so you look at countries around the world and you look beyond the U.S., and Clyde rightly says, we live, I wouldn't call it delusional or fool's paradise, but, we live in a more fortunate situation than most other countries, that there's no problem issuing debt in dollars and getting people to buy it. So actually the adjustment for us is much easier than it would be for, say, Hungary or Argentina or Mexico. The other side of it is China, and I think that is important, and there's reason to be upset about China underpricing its exports and trying to get rich off the backs of American consumers in unfair ways, but basically because it's unfair, and it distorts the trading system and makes it harder to sustain open markets in the U.S., and it oppresses certain groups of American workers. But it's not because in some macro sense this is hurting us. The final point I would make is China actually is already adjusting. I mean, Clyde can make the point about the roads, but you can just as easily say, well, that just gives them more useful infrastructure they can invest in the next couple of years, and they can have a domestic building boom instead of shipping all their steel abroad. And my colleague at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, Nick Lardy, who's our China expert and is very, very good, has looked very carefully at the Chinese program, and he feels their recent stimulus package going into next year is very much oriented towards domestic spending. And it's not because Nick is a panda hugger or whatever is the term that is abused here in Congress. I mean, Nick spent a lot of years berating the Chinese government for undervaluing their currency and doing insufficient demand. So he's just driven by the facts. And that doesn't mean he's necessarily right, but it means in his best objective assessment, which I happen to agree with less expertise, but I happen to agree with, is the Chinese are massively ramping up domestic growth over the next couple of years. So I guess I do fundamentally differ with Clyde that I don't think this adjustment is going to be that difficult.
Adam, before I let you off this hook, what about Germany, which has also been running very large current account surpluses? And maybe I'm overstating it, but Angela Merkel said, in effect, at least as I heard it, we're an export economy and we're going to stay that way.
Right.
So in a sense, she was saying that, well, if imbalances are a problem, we're not going to deal with them.
Yeah. No, Ken, you're absolutely right. That is a fair characterization of the way the German government, including Chancellor Merkel, treated everybody else. And it is, in times of global contraction like this, it is basically, parasitical's a little strong, so let's say free riding. on others' efforts. You know, when the world economy is growing and some countries are going up and some countries are going down, but most are going up, you know, if you trade more and you do more exporting than importing, basically you're just reallocating your share of various things, but you're not doing it at somebody else's expense. When the globe as a whole is contracting and everybody's going down, if you do exports only, you are free riding on other people's domestic demand. And so in this circumstance, I am very critical of the German government, not as a long-term thing. I think, frankly, their export orientation has served them very badly. My book, which no one will read, but when it comes out, tries to explain why the export model for Germany has actually served them very badly for the last 40 years. But in the short term, I think they are making the problem worse by taking that attitude. I agree.
Well, let me open it up for questions. I've been very careful not to give my own opinions, which is very tough. It's the disadvantage of being a moderator. If you could please just identify yourselves. Marty?
Marty Tolchin.
We have just a moment, we'll have a microphone right there.
Marty Tolchin.
It won't amplify in the room, it's just
Oh.
recording.
Oh, okay. Marty Tolchin, Woodrow Wilson Center.
So speak loudly for
My
the rest of the
my
team.
question is, how important is the automobile industry to getting out of this recession? Is the domestic automobile industry in getting out of this recession?
So Marty's posing the question, how important is the automobile industry for getting out of this recession? And maybe I'll take the liberty of dividing that in two parts. One, getting out of the recession, and two, how important is the automobile industry longer term? Clyde?
Marty, let me ask you a question. When you say the domestic automobile industry, you talking about the big three, or are you talking about, because my answer would be, I think the automobile industry in the United States, including the transplants, is very important to getting out of the recession. But it's not clear to me that the big three are. I think that I guess to put it this way, I have looked at this, as you know, for a long time. I think that what the Obama administration has done in trying to, keep some remnant of the big three alive is largely, I don't agree with every detail, but I think that the thrust of what they've done is important for the overall economy. Not even so much because of the big three, but because of the network of suppliers and dealers and all the people who are tied into the automobile industry. And so that I think it has been and will prevent kind of a rippling unemployment and a downward spiral effect. But right now, the U.S. auto industry is selling, about 8.5 million, at the rate of 8.5 million cars annually. Last year, I think the sales for the industry were 16 million. This is 2 years ago. It's just a huge drop. So if the U.S. auto industry is going to be producing at 8.5, 9 million annual rate for some time to come, that's a significant decline in GDP. I have to believe that it's going to get back to something above that. And I guess that a large part of that will be supplied by the non-big three manufacturers. Although it's very interesting to contrast Ford with Chrysler and General Motors. One could imagine that GM particularly, once it gets some of these millstones that's been around its neck removed, might be able to rebound fairly smartly. But, I don't think that, in my view, it's not necessary to have a Ford and a Chrysler and a General Motors to have an economic rebound.
Remember, we always invite questions from the servants of the Congress. We'll go to another, and then we'll go to Dan back.
Hi, my name is Daniel Lamotte. I'm with Lamotte Capital. I have a question regarding the standard of living for Americans and non-Americans in the next decade or so. What do you see as the trend for the standard of living? And is it a zero-sum game that as the Asians become more affluent, that we in the West will become less affluent, especially given the fact that we'll be competing for more resources from limited resources?
Adam, what do you think?
I've got depressing news, but probably not quite in the way you expect it. I think the trend rate of growth in both the U.S. and most of the world is going to be slower for the next several years than it's been. There was evidence even before the financial crisis that the productivity growth rate in the U.S. had slowed down. And the financial crisis, between raising interest rates, because we are issuing a lot of government debt, disrupting financial system, which even if it was wasteful, it's better to have one than not have one. Companies understandably and people understandably skipping cycles of either human investment or corporate investment. That all goes normally to building productivity, and we're skipping some of that. And so I think, and the reason I emphasize productivity is over the long run, over anything more than like 2 or 3 years, wage growth, standard of living is basically going to track the productivity of your economy. There's some variations, but roughly speaking, that's the best measure we got. So productivity growth is probably going to be slower, not just in the U.S., but in a lot of other places. And so the rate of increase in standard of living ain't going to be what it was, what we've gotten used to over the last 10, 15 years. Now, obviously in the U.S. in particular, there are distributional issues that the standard of living improved a lot more for certain groups of people than for others. That's in the power of Congress to change, but some of these productivity issues, it's not something Congress can do much about. But the part where I'm going to differ is I don't think of it as zero-sum. There are, as I mentioned, as Kent was right to point out, in short-term interactions, like Germany right now, I think it is somewhat zero-sum. But I think over the long term, the fact that India and China, literally hundreds of millions of people in India and China coming out of poverty, was a win for us. Both in the obvious sense that, okay, it's a better, more secure world and it's a more just world if that happens, but also since I don't think they really hurt wages of most people in the U.S. If you look at what the Chinese or the Indians were exporting or where their job growth was, it was mostly in things the U.S. doesn't produce or stopped producing long ago. They were further down the development chain. Even in India, where we have all these ideas in our head of, they set up these call centers and they lost jobs in the U.S. because of that, colleagues of mine at our institute, Jacob Kierkegaard, Catherine Mann, have done studies showing that actually most companies that did that on net created more jobs in the U.S. I mean, again, it's one of those things where, like with trade, there's disruption for individual businesses and people, which is not trivial and is very visible. But for the economy as a whole, actually, it's not been zero-sum. And so what I think is going to happen is just as we've all risen together in the last few years, I think we're going to move sideways together for the next few years.
Clyde, what do you think?
I want to throw another variable into the mix because I think that the future development is not going to look like the past in two respects. One is that because of the problems of environmental degradation, I think that the development path that we've witnessed over the past 50 years for countries like Japan, Korea, and the Tigers, and so forth, is increasingly not a viable development path. In other words, if everybody in China has the same amount of emissions and pollution as every American, I don't think the global economy works. So I think one big challenge is really inventing an economic model that enables growth and productivity, but without the waste and environmental degradation of the model that we've been pursuing for some time. And secondly, I think that part of that model actually implies less, as you all I'm sure know, Tom Friedman wrote this book, The World is Flat. I think that the world may be getting rounder again. And what I mean is this. If you study the global supply chain, look at the world from the perspective of somebody like FedEx. And right now, the most profitable single flight that FedEx has is FX24 Shanghai to Memphis. Now, put in a cap and trade system. Begin pricing carbon. Add to that, in a recovery, a rise again in the price of oil. And add to that some adjustment in exchange rates as part of a global rebalancing of current account imbalances. And you have a potentially tremendous impact on the global supply chain in the direction of producing things closer to the location of demand. And in fact, I have been studying the global supply chain a bit recently, and it's really interesting to see shifts that have already been made. Flextronics, which is a company, a contract manufacturing company with plants in Malaysia and China and Mexico. Flextronics has been shifting production to Mexico in response to rise in price of oil and some other anticipated changes. So I think that as we think about economic growth and competition going forward, we need to really factor in the importance of developing a new model, and secondly, the impact on production patterns and trade patterns of pricing carbon and of readjusting the imbalances and resource scarcity.
This gentleman and that gentleman.
Go first.
Thank you.
And then please identify yourself.
I'm Rick Smith from the Wilson Centre, Australian scholar there. Questions, if I may. Firstly, Gordon Brown is reported to have said at around the time of the G20 that this was the end of the Washington Consensus. Now, leave aside the argument about what the heck that means and whether that matters. Do you think that the global financial crisis is going to accelerate the shift in economic weight and power to Asia? Or do you think that there'll be a rebalancing back towards the North Atlantic, as it were, when we work our way through the crisis? Secondly, then, we've talked about, Clyde talked about the renminbi perhaps becoming a yuan, becoming a reserve currency. What would be the effect of that if it were to happen tomorrow, however it happens? What effect would that have on world trade? And again, what if the renminbi were floated? What effect would that have? Thank you.
In terms of Brown's statement, it was a nifty bit of rhetoric that I would not have written for him. But let's go to your more fundamental question. I mean, there are two pieces to what you're saying about Washington Consensus. One is politically who has the weight, and the other is intellectually who has the model. And I think that on both of those, the Anglo-American sort of West financial has suffered a blow, but it's going to be, temporarily at least, bigger on the model than on the weight. So on the model, not everything about Anglo-American finance defines our capitalism, and not everything should be thrown out, but we really did genuinely make a mistake and go down the wrong path in some ways. And, you know, I have a colleague, Simon Johnson, who's written these rather populist articles, about some of which I agree with, but, you know, very much about how the bankers captured the U.S. and did all these terrible things. And my point of view is there was certainly opportunistic bankers who did that. But mostly it was the people in power were genuinely intellectually wrong. Whether it was Larry Summers or Hank Paulson, Ben Bernanke, who's a co-author of mine, I respect enormously, or Alan Greenspan, and to a lesser degree minor people like me, we all bought into varying degrees that this particular model of exporting securitized finance was going to solve a lot of problems. And that turned out to be politically very nice for certain rich people and certain interests and that were then exploited, but the policymakers, I think, genuinely believed that, and it turns out we were wrong, and sometimes that happens. I don't, and we should admit we were wrong. But the model, there isn't an obvious model to come after it. I mean, the Chinese I don't think, want to be seen as a total model, and I don't think, for many of the reasons, I think Clyde was absolutely spot on about the environmental limits and the global supply chain limits and things like that. I don't think it can be emulated in the same degree by a lot of other countries in any way. Now, in terms of the power, sort of economic size and weight, it's clear that China and Brazil and possibly India are the three countries who are going to be least damaged by the crisis in some way. But the U.S. will run a close fourth. As bad as things are, we're going to actually rebound faster than most other advanced countries, and certainly the weak emerging markets are in trouble. So the fundamental size power shift is not going to be accelerated that much, in my opinion, by the recent events. But the intellectual gap that what was perceived as the most recent version of the Washington Consensus has been in many ways discredited, but there's no clear alternative out there, is going to be an issue.
So, to paraphrase Adam, I think what we're saying is that the Washington Consensus was worse than a crime. It was a mistake. I think, in fact, there is a shift in model that's already taken place. I mean, essentially, simplifying, but essentially the Washington Consensus kind of argued that markets are self-adjusting, optimize efficiency, and so just leave everything to the market. I don't think that going forward we're going to have that same benign neglect attitude towards the market. And so I think we're going to have a model which may, in fact, look a little bit more like the European model. I mean, I'm still trying to wrap my mind around what I read this morning about this GM deal. The U.S. government is going to be the biggest shareholder in General Motors. The U.S. government owns AIG. It's going to own General Motors and huge stakes and everything else. I mean, isn't this the German model?
And it works so well.
Something close to it. I don't know. But anyhow, I think going forward we're going to have much more of a mixed model in which the role of the government is going to be more present in a lot of different ways. As far as the shift in balance of kind of economic weight or power, I actually think the crisis slows up the shift towards Asia. It's true on the one hand that India, China, Brazil, as Adam said, will probably be the least hurt by it. But, India and China are now growing at 5% a year instead of 10% a year. And all those charts that we saw in the past projecting China to be the world's biggest economy by 2030 or something were based on China growing at 10% a year indefinitely. Well, it's obviously not going to do that. So I think it slows down that trajectory. But at the same time, there are other elements. You raised the currency issue. I do think that I'm not expecting the dollar to disappear as the major currency tomorrow, but I think that we are in the beginning moments of a shift away from the dollar, and then that leads to your question. Well, what if the yuan is floated? What if it were floated tomorrow? Well, actually, if the yuan were floated tomorrow, mean, none of us know what would happen, but I could easily imagine a flight of capital from China. And many Chinese have, their money in the mattresses. They don't trust the Chinese government. And I could easily imagine a flood of capital out of China if the currency were really floated tomorrow. But put aside the short-term immediate reaction, if the yuan becomes a reserve currency, or if the euro becomes, I mean, right now I think there's a big question mark over the euro, but if the euro survives and becomes a real reserve currency, and if there were an Asian currency, either the yuan or some combination of Asian currencies, there are real alternative reserve currencies to the dollar, that diminishes the power of the U.S. economically and forces discipline on the U.S. In ways that we haven't really faced since the early 1940s. In some ways, I think that discipline's good for us because it would then force us to be responsible, fiscally responsible, and force us to invest productively. So in the long term, I think it's good for us, but it would certainly be a diminishment of our ability to ignore economic realities.
Adam?
Yeah, I just want to come in a moment on the currency. Partly because we just released a book last Thursday that I edited called The Euro at 10, the Next Global Currency, and we talk about the video of the events on the Institute website, or you can buy a copy of the book, even better.
Will you autograph those copies?
Absolutely. My big X, Yeah. No, his is for Mother's Day. Mine's for Father's Day. But joking aside, I mean, we make a serious assessment of this issue. Is the euro a real alternative? Is the yuan a real alternative? And I think the answer is they're going to continue to rise in influence and importance, but no, they're not. There are some fundamental geopolitical, institutional, and despite recent years, financial advantages the U.S. has that the Chinese currency certainly does not, and the European currency is lacking in varying degrees. And I can go into that in more detail if you want, but just fundamentally it's not going to happen. I think the basic point is, as the economic historian from Berkeley, Barry Eichengreen, has argued, the UK pound sterling and the dollar coexisted essentially as partial reserve currencies for many decades. I mean, the decline and disappearance of sterling starts before World War I in some ways and doesn't really end until you get to the early 60s. Certainly Suez maybe is where you want to draw the line, but actually that would be where you draw the line. But that's 40 years, 40, 50 years. So these things can coexist. It doesn't have to be one reserve currency. You can have, it's not quite all or nothing, whereas that gentleman was talking about zero sum. Right now, the euro is not a reserve currency, but they have the two big benefits. They get seniorage because there are people outside their region who use it, and they can issue debt in euro-denominated debt. And that hasn't so far hurt the U.S., except possibly at the margin because drug dealers in Eastern Europe prefer the euro to the dollar. Okay.
This gentleman is next.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I guess I can hear this.
No, it's just for recording.
Okay.
It's for recording you for posterity.
Okay. Good afternoon. My name's Todd Wiggins. I have a quick a question about something I saw in the news the other day, in which a group somewhere in the northeast U.S. are using their own currency called the Berkshires. And I thought that was very interesting, but understanding that there has been a precedent for that. I believe it's at the beginning of the century where people came up with some other kind of regional or local currency. I didn't know that something like that could exist and could be enforced.
It can't. I mean, Kent's actually the lawyer here. So in addition to being a PhD economist, he's a lawyer, so he can correct me. But it can't be enforced except as a civil contract. So in other words, I can voluntarily decide that I'm going to play in the system of the Berkshire currency or whatever it is. But it's not legal tender. You know, I pull the dollar bill out of my my pocket and it says on it, this is legal tender for all debts, public and private, I cannot not only not pay my U.S. taxes in Berkshires, if somebody, well, no, I can pay my rent there, but at any point that landlord can say to me, I want to be paid in dollars rather than in Berkshires. Ultimately, I can't force him to accept the Berkshires or her to accept the Berkshires. I mean, it's that. But I think what's important to realize about that kind of thing is, it's a horrible image, but think back to the Great Depression, and there were always those signs, you'd see in the photos of homeless men, jobless men, keep moving, we can't take care of our own. I mean, this is essentially the same thing. What you're saying is, and it's understandable, I mean, there's a certain ethic behind it. You're saying, let's keep the money in the community, let's look after each other, we're in this together. And you are effectively saying you're trapping the money there. Because you're saying, okay, Berkshires are only accepted in the Berkshires. And so therefore you are substituting. So you may be, buying your apples only from Macintosh apples from the people who grow them. I grew up in Boston, that's what, So who grow them in the Berkshires and not buying any Washington State Fuji apples, and maybe at the margin that helps keep your local farmer employed, and you sacrifice a little bit in consumer choice, and you think that's a good thing. But both ethically and economically, it's not quite sustainable that you really want to draw that kind of barrier around your little society there, I think.
So we'll know it's serious when the Peterson Institute issues its own Peterson dollars.
If we issue Peterson dollars, it's time for you guys to be buying Chinese yuan.
Wouldn't you call them Pete's?
Yeah. We have a gentleman here with a question.
Thank you very much. My name is Nia Kwete, and I want to shift the discussion a little bit to the IMF's supervision of African economies and the thinking inside the IMF, the model question. If the Washington consensus has been damaged, and I'm looking at the idea that government can now seem to be a solution, that stimulus and deficits are not always a bad thing, and that regulation by governments is not also a bad thing. Now, yes, Gordon Brown said it, but he wasn't the only one. Several people said it. Even our president here said it in a different way. I'm impressed by how many people have said it. What worries me is who have not said it. That's the IMF. They haven't said it. And yet their power, their money, has been tripled. And they are being given more power to supervise African countries where we've had a string of IMF riots over the issue of whether, for instance, there can be deficit spending on education. I'm from Ghana, and you'll see a lot of school children on the street because just after I finished school, they privatized school and parents have to pay. And this was pushed by the IMF. So my worry is, why are they not saying that they were wrong on some of the Washington consensus, and if they are afraid to say it, shouldn't we be worried in Africa?
Well, let me make a couple points. There's a gentleman who officially represents the IMF in the back of the room, and that doesn't mean he's right, but he should be entitled to say his piece in a little bit. But from my point of view, and I hope Clyde and Kent don't mind that I grab the mic on this one, I think there's a, without trying to make excuses, I think there has been much more change at the IMF than you're giving it credit for, and I think also some things shouldn't change. The changes that I'm not sure you're giving quite enough credit for, not because it's made the facts on the ground, say in Ghana, that much better. So that's part of the point. But there's been a lot of rethinking, even within the IMF. And so, for example, at this Euro event we had the other day, I got into a bit, it's on the website, I got into a bit of a dust-up with a guy named Vito Tanzi, who used to run the fiscal department at the IMF. And he was the great advocate of balanced budgets before all, never run a deficit, never spend on public works, all that. And I openly said, I think a lot of that is excessive and wrong, and in fact, your colleagues at the IMF have changed their rules on some of that. Similarly, I mean, I can go through a whole laundry list of things. Similarly, I think there's been a recognition. Not everybody at the IMF agreed with it, and not everybody recognized it to the same degree, but at a high level, there's been a recognition that all these excessive demands for rapid privatizations and things like that, you know, the worst example being the way they went in Indonesia and, you know, come to Sue with arms crossed is photographed overlooking Suharto, and Suharto was a corrupt thug. You know, so I don't shed any tears for Suharto, but, you know, the image of going in and the IMF saying, oh, and while you're at it, privatize the clove monopoly. I mean, you know, this was, and I think there is very broad acceptance at the IMF that was a mistake and was short-sighted. The place, and there's also been an institutional change at the IMF. There used to be, and again, the official from the IMF may interpret it differently, but this is my personal opinion. There used to be a department called PDR, Policy Development and Review, which was essentially like the political commissars in the old Soviet Union. You know, you'd have a policy-making department, and there would be a politician from somebody delegated by the Communist Party to make sure whatever was done was in line with doctrine. That was what PDR's job was. And PDR has essentially been shaken up and completely turned over and replaced, and their emphasis now is surveillance. And as we discussed, surveillance isn't the answer to everything, but it's certainly a more constructive thing than what they were doing. So I think, without making excuses to the IMF, I think one has to be fair. They actually have moved a long way in a lot of things. The piece I would emphasize, though, is that there are certain laws of economic physics, so to speak, that just can't be repealed. I'm not saying you were saying otherwise. Don't get me wrong. I just have to say it's for the record. And it's in line with what Clyde was saying about, you know, things about the U.S. overspending and so on. So rather than talk about a specific African country, let's take, for example, Hungary right now. Hungary is probably, except for Iceland, the worst hit. Well, Ukraine. All right. So Hungary is one of the worst hit northern hemisphere countries by the financial crisis. They're in very severe problems, and they do have political problems and huge cutbacks. And Hungary is your classic sort of IMF adjustment case. They were running enormous deficits in the public sector. They weren't transparent about them. They lied about them. They had no controls. And while they were doing that, all kinds of people and banks were borrowing money in foreign currency because the Hungarian, what is it, the zloty or whatever? No, zloty's Poland, florent, I think, was wrapped up. And they were running this completely unsustainable real estate boom, and, you know, and it came to a halt. And the IMF is in there lending money to Hungary, but with strict conditionality, saying, you know, you can't get the money if you don't cut back on the budget deficits. And cutting back on the budget deficits in Hungary, it's not as difficult as it would be in Ghana, but it's a hell of a lot more difficult than it is in the U.S. I mean, it does mean taking food out of people's mouths, shutting schools, things like that. You know, and I don't like it, but in the case like Hungary, I'm just not sure there's that much else you can do. The problem was when the fund thought, while we're there, we want to twist everybody's arms and say, you know, the size of the public sector should shrink no matter what, irrespective of whether or not you can pay for it. The role of government, going back to what Clyde was saying, has to be smaller, irrespective of the right of a country to make its choices about that. I mean, I think we've moved to a model, not entirely, but I think we've moved to a model that if you can pay for it, you should be allowed to do it. But the basic idea that you have to be able to pay for it, and to be frank, for all the shenanigans of the U.S. in the last few years, market, at least having majority market rules in your system helps you pay for it, is real. I mean, my take. I think the guy from the fund may want to say something.
We'll give 2 seconds. We're actually past your witching hours, so.
I think Adam has
Were you from
answered.
the Politburo or the?
No, and they weren't. It's not. I think it's the wrong analogy. I don't think it's the Communist Party. I think it's the Jesuits. Okay. But Adam answered a lot of questions. Let me just say one thing, which I think is very important, related to the Ghanaian experience. I'm not a specialist in Ghana. I don't want to go into what was privatized, who said do it. But here's the point. I think one of the underlying notions of the so-called Washington Consensus was that people in Washington or people in the metropole knew best what the world should do. And obviously a lot of mistakes were made as a result of that, and the IMF made plenty of those kinds of mistakes. But here's what's changed, is that on the ground in countries, be it Indonesia or Ghana, is there has been very significant pushback where governments have said, we understand what's best. And you can't simply come in and tell us what to do, that we have to have a proper exchange over what's necessary in our country. And I think you look at Ghana. Ghana has not had an IMF program, i.e. borrowing from the IMF, for the last few years. And Ghana feels very comfortable, an elected democratic government pushing back on IMF recommendations. And I think this is a very important change. The IMF last year had people saying, well, you know, you should raise your electricity tariffs. And the Ghanaian government said, thank you, but we have elections coming. We're not going to raise electricity tariffs. Thank you for your advice. Okay? Here's the point. It's the notion of government ownership. And I think that the degree to which the IMF can work with governments, recognize the errors, and find the things that have to be addressed in order to assure greater stability and growth in the future and poverty reduction in the case of low-income countries will be to the advantage of everybody.
Well, we really have.
May want to say one other thing.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I mean, I agree with all of that, and it's not extreme to either side. What worries me is that when everyone is saying there is, you know, we didn't get it 100% right on the Washington consensus, the IMF is the only one who's not saying.
No, we've said it many, many times. I'd be happy to point you to where.
This one's a mea culpa.
Well, we have.
Literature is overwhelming.
We've long passed the witching hour. Let me just call on David Klaus for the penultimate word. Okay. Well, I want to call everyone's attention to the Wilson Center mailing card here. Sign up for whatever happens to interest you. And let me just ask you to circle the dates on your calendar. May 12th, B338, the China Environmental Forum. We'll be talking about health and pollution in China, and perhaps the U.S. interest and the congressional interest in helping do something about it. Well, now, could I ask you all to join me in a round of applause for an outstanding panel?